Get back! The warning cut through the air, sharp and instinctive, the words barely leaving the speaker's mouth before bodies scrambled away. A cluster of cadets backed against the reinforced walls of the combat gymnasium, their eyes locked on the lone figure who had just dropped from the overhead gravity rings without a sound. Dorian Holt straightened, rolling his shoulders as if shrugging off the tension in the room. The gym's artificial gravity had been adjusted for standard species, lighter, accommodating, soft on the joints. To him it felt thin, fragile, like standing on ice that hadn't fully hardened. He hated it. Eyes burned into him from every direction. He knew that look. Predatory creatures sizing up something they didn't understand, but inherently feared. A sharp tsk of annoyance came from the left. "I don't see the point of this," Sin Ralvek muttered, his reptilian tail flicking once against the polished floor before curling tight behind him. His elongated pupils contracted, nostrils flaring as if Dorian's presence was an infection. "We train soldiers here, not unchecked weapons." "Unchecked?" Dorian let the word sit, rolling it over like a blade on a whetstone. Ralvek's forked tongue flicked out, a nervous tick. "Enough!" Instructor Varric Telnos cut in. He stepped forward with a soldier's gait, measured and intentional, the kind that spoke of decades of leading wars rather than just studying them. His piercing black eyes bore into Dorian. "If the Imperium has decided a Deathworlder is to join my program, then I will break him like I would any other recruit. If he is to be here, he earns his place through blood, sweat, and shattered bones." No one laughed. No one spoke. Telnos wasn't being metaphorical. The reinforced combat floor gleamed beneath the Academy's stark white overhead lights, its surface scored with the ghostly imprints of past duels, some deep enough to mark the failures of previous cadets. Telnos turned away, already dismissing Dorian. "Combat readiness trial. Now." Someone inhaled sharply. Even among the Imperium's elite, the combat readiness trial was known to be brutal, a controlled test of strength, agility, and battlefield instincts, designed to break those who weren't meant to fight. It wasn't meant for first-day recruits. It was meant to weed out the weak. Dorian cracked his knuckles. About time. The cadets watching him weren't sure whether to be terrified or intrigued. The first challenge was the Zero-G adaptation course. Dorian launched himself forward before the countdown even finished. The moment he hit the first unstable platform, he adjusted, not the way the others did, with controlled propulsion, but with raw calculation. He used the course against itself, shifting his weight at the last second, pushing off barely there surfaces that weren't even meant to be used for leverage. The alien cadets stared. Ralvek scowled. "He's not following the standard maneuver pattern." "Because he doesn't need to." Drake Othvan, massive, four-armed, built like a living war tank, crossed his arms. Unlike Ralvek, he didn't sound bitter. He sounded interested. The final section of the course involved a spinning gravitational node designed to disorient and forcibly reset movement coordination. Most cadets hesitated. Dorian didn't break stride. His body twisted mid-air, using the violent spin to redirect his momentum rather than resist it. He landed at the finish in a low crouch, breathing steady, muscles loose. Telnos made no expression. "Time." A low beep from the scoreboard. He had broken the record by nearly 15 seconds. Next was impact resistance. Other species relied on shock absorption vests or kinetic dampeners to handle extreme force. Dorian had neither. He stepped into the combat ring. His opponent was a towering Zarian, built for durability, muscles corded with fiber-like reinforcement beneath his reptilian hide. The objective was simple: take a direct hit and remain standing. The instructor motioned for the Zarian to strike. The blow landed, a thunderous impact that sent a sharp ripple through the floor. But Dorian didn't buckle. He absorbed the force, feet shifting a fraction, torso twisting just enough to redirect the energy, like a tree bending under a storm, but never snapping. The Zarian blinked. Dorian exhaled slowly. Again. The next strike was harder. Dorian took it like he was built for war, rather than just trained for it. The murmurs in the gym grew louder. Even Telnos seemed mildly intrigued now. His body... Leon Voss, the psychic specialist, was staring at Dorian with something close to fascination. His structure is compensating instinctively. He's recalibrating. Dorian rolled his shoulders again, adjusting his stance. Keep hitting me, or pick someone who can. A nervous shift ran through the cadets. No one moved forward. The final test, reaction time gauntlet. Automated drone turrets surrounded the ring. The objective was to dodge a randomized series of energy bolts. Each cadet was expected to last a minimum of 30 seconds. Dorian lasted 4 minutes, not because the system slowed, because it couldn't keep up with him. His movements weren't calculated the way aliens relied on pre-programmed muscle memory. He read the room, read the attacks before they even happened. When the system tried to predict him, he changed patterns. When it altered its attack angles, he switched his footing before the bolts even fired. By the end, the AI shut down, overloaded with miscalculations. The gym was silent. "That's enough," Telnos said finally. His gaze locked on Dorian. Not dismissive anymore. Measuring. "Holt," Dorian lifted his chin. "You didn't just complete the tests. You rewrote them." Something heavy settled over the room. Ralvik's expression was thunderous. Drake Othvan let out a slow exhale. Leon Voss, still staring, still unsettled. Telnos turned, but there was no ignoring the shift in his tone. "Report to war simulation chambers. Your trial isn't over." No one moved. The cadets knew what that meant. The war simulation was never used for recruits. Dorian simply grinned. Perfect. Dorian walked through the reinforced corridors of the war simulation wing, the scent of cold metal and sterilized air thick in his lungs. The walls pulsed with embedded conduits, casting sporadic flashes of red light that slashed across his peripheral vision. Shadows stretched unnaturally, morphing with each flicker, as if the entire facility was breathing around him, waiting. Behind him the other cadets followed, their footsteps uneven, their silence heavy, with the weight of something unspoken. The tension in the air coiled like a storm about to break. Leon Voss's gaze bore into the back of his skull. The psychic specialist had been studying him since the gym, his normally indifferent expression tinged with something else now, something sharper. "You moved before the turrets fired." The words weren't a question. Dorian didn't slow. "I moved when I saw them react." Leon's voice remained even, but the edge beneath it was impossible to miss. "They don't react. They predict, which means they're wrong." A beat of silence followed. The other cadets didn't know how to respond to that. They had spent years trusting the Academy's technology, believing in its superiority. To them, Dorian wasn't just fast, he was a contradiction. Sin Ralvik, trailing a short distance behind, exhaled sharply through his nostrils. "I still don't buy it. The human's not untouchable, just reckless." Dorian's mouth twitched. "Tell yourself whatever helps you sleep, Ralvik." The reptilian strategist didn't answer, but the sound of his claws scraping lightly against the floor betrayed his irritation. A second later the blast doors groaned apart. The chamber beyond swallowed the light, revealing a combat zone, nothing like the sterile training simulations they had expected. The air was heavier here, thicker, humming, not with machinery but something more primal, more ancient. This wasn't a test. It was a battlefield, waiting to happen. Varric Telnos stood near the observation deck, his stance rigid. His black gaze swept over the gathered cadets, resting on Dorian last. "Inside the simulation, you will operate as a single unit." His voice was stone, carved and unyielding. Your objective is simple: survive and extract. No additional details. No mention of enemy formations or terrain conditions. Only survive. The hesitation among the cadets was almost tangible. Dorian stepped forward first. How long? Telnos tilted his head slightly. Long enough to prove whether or not a Deathworlder deserves to be here. No one moved. Then, slowly, the rest of the cadets filed in behind him. The moment the last one entered, the doors sealed, and the world turned to hell. The simulated battlefield wasn't a city or a desert or any terrain that could be rationalized as training. It was a war-torn abyss, an open stretch of ground, fractured by deep craters, half-buried structures, and scorched metal. The sky overhead was an unnatural slate gray, flickering with distant energy bursts, and the very air felt charged with the remnants of past violence. Then the first explosion hit. Heat seared against exposed skin. The force knocked several cadets backward, the impact rattling through their bones. Drake Othven gritted his teeth, steadying himself. That was live ordnance, Dorian cut in, already scanning the terrain. The energy signature of the blast didn't match simulated detonation sequences. The pressure waves, the aftershock, it was real. Another explosion erupted further ahead, and the realization finally crashed into the cadets with full force. This wasn't an exercise. Someone had locked them inside a real war zone. Leon Voss's breath came sharp. This is wrong. Telnos wouldn't... Doesn't matter, Dorian interrupted, already moving. Standing still got people killed. Find cover and spread formation. Keep sightlines open. No clustering. The others hesitated, uncertain whether to follow a human's command. Another blast shattered a section of debris, forcing their decision. Ralvik hissed but complied, breaking left with Vorin Alzith, their movements fluid. Drake Othven took point alongside Dorian, his forearms flexing as he assessed their rapidly deteriorating situation. If this is real, we're down one critical factor: intel. Drake nodded once. Their entire training had revolved around structured battles, predictable encounters. But this was chaos. Dorian didn't need a psychic to tell him what the others were thinking. If the human can't pull them through this, they're all dead. They reached the ruins of what might have once been a tactical outpost. The reinforced barricades were scarred from previous engagements, twisted into jagged remnants of failed defenses. Sin Ralvik crouched low, his reptilian gaze darting between shadows. His species was built for strategy, not brute force. He thrived on analyzing enemies before engaging. That's why his next words sent a chill through the entire group. We are not alone. The air around them shifted, not with movement, with intent. A figure emerged from the wreckage ahead, tall, armored, but unmistakably not one of the simulation constructs. Then another, then 5 more. Drake Othven's muscles coiled. Who the hell are they? Dorian already knew the answer. The Forsaken Legion. Their insignia was faded, almost indistinguishable, but it was there, the mark of an enemy force that was supposed to have been eradicated years ago. And yet here they were, real, armed, ready. Leon Voss's voice tightened. This isn't just a hijacked simulation? No, Dorian agreed. This was an ambush. The Legion moved first. Dorian moved faster. The first soldier lunged, a sharp, efficient strike aimed for Dorian's ribs. He shifted just enough, forcing the blade to glance off his side rather than impale. No wasted motion. The second attacker was already on him, plasma round charging. Dorian used the first soldier's weight against them, twisting hard, a move the enemy didn't expect, because no one else fought like that here. The plasma round discharged, straight into the attacker's own squadmate. Chaos erupted. Drake Othven roared, barreling forward like a force of nature, all 4 arms ripping into the enemy line with brutal efficiency. Ralvek went low, knives flashing, using the shadows as his weapon. Leon Voss's abilities rippled through the air, not strong enough to fully incapacitate, but enough to disorient. Dorian didn't think. He reacted. He moved through the gaps of battle like he had done it 1,000 times before, because he had. This wasn't a fight. It was survival. And Dorian Holt never lost. Dorian's pulse hammered in his ears as he drove his boot into the fallen soldier's chest, forcing the last breath from his lungs before twisting away from the next strike. The air reeked of charred metal and the coppery tang of blood. The heat from nearby plasma discharges scorched against his exposed skin, but he ignored it. Pain meant he was still alive. The Forsaken Legion soldiers fought with lethal intent. Their strikes were calculated, their movements refined by experience rather than simulation. These weren't panicked trainees thrown into combat for the first time. They were professionals, killers, which meant this wasn't a test gone wrong. Dorian twisted around a jagged chunk of collapsed barricade, his mind racing through 100 questions he didn't have time to answer. Who had allowed the Legion access? How had they infiltrated a secured War Academy simulation? Most importantly, what was their objective? He would find out, if he survived. To his left, Drake Othvin's 4 massive arms grappled with 2 soldiers at once, the heavy thud of impact vibrating through the fractured ground. One opponent tried to duck under him, but Drake's lower arms snatched them mid-dodge, spine-crushing strength cutting the movement short. The other attacker aimed a plasma rifle at his exposed flank. Dorian didn't hesitate. He drove forward, boots slipping on debris, fingers locking around the barrel of the rifle before it discharged. The heat scorched his palm, but he wrenched it aside, redirected the shot, right into the attacker's own knee. The soldier crumpled with a strangled sound, and Drake finished the job with a single brutal punch. Holt! The warning barely registered before Dorian's instincts kicked in, his body already ducking before his mind caught up. A plasma bolt sizzled through the air, where his head had been an instant ago. He pivoted, caught sight of Sin Ralvek, vaulting over a collapsed structure, his reptilian frame twisting mid-air. 2 more, high ground, behind the broken scaffolding. Dorian's eyes snapped up. There, a sniper nest had formed above the wreckage, using the shadows to conceal movement. The Legion was coordinating, moving like a strike team. That meant they had an objective, and that objective wasn't killing cadets, which meant they were buying time for something worse. "Voss!" Dorian barked, already sprinting forward. "Get me a read on their movement patterns, now!" Leon Voss gritted his teeth, his psychic abilities straining under the pressure of the active battlefield. Too many conflicting signals? Try harder! Voss exhaled sharply, his irises flaring for half a second. Then, "They're hurting us." The words hit like a dropped hammer. Dorian's stomach turned cold. They weren't in a war zone. They were in a trap. And the door was about to shut. The battlefield shifted again, subtly at first, then violently. The air hummed with a deep, unnatural frequency, sending tremors through Dorian's bones. Then the gravity failed. For a fraction of a second, everything froze. Then the cadets were yanked upward.
The artificial battlefield wasn't just a physical location. It was an environmental construct, programmable and adaptive. And someone with absolute control had just overridden the settings. Dorian twisted in freefall, vision tilting as the battlefield inverted. The ground rushed away from him. The sky became the new floor. Debris and broken structures plummeted alongside bodies, some spinning helplessly, others already recalibrating. Dorian wasn't the only one who had trained in zero gravity, but he was the only one who had lived in it. Air filled his lungs as he flattened his trajectory, correcting his drift with a slight shift in weight. Others weren't so lucky. A Zarian cadet screamed as they collided with a crumbling scaffold, bones breaking on impact. Another struggled against their own momentum, spinning uncontrollably. Move toward the wreckage. Use it to stabilize. Dorian barked, but only some of them heard him. Ralvik had already adapted, his long tail snapping against a floating structure to correct his course. Voss was fighting to keep from blacking out, his psychic senses overloaded by the sheer chaos. Drake Othavin was barely holding himself together, his massive bulk making stabilization nearly impossible, and the Legion soldiers, they were navigating like they had trained for this. Dorian cursed. This wasn't just an ambush, it was a tactical execution. Whoever had designed this wanted the cadets dead or useless. Telnos should have overridden the system by now. Ralvik snarled, struggling against the pull. Why hasn't he? Because he's not in control anymore. Dorian snapped. This wasn't an isolated attack. It was a coordinated takeover. Someone had hijacked the entire war simulation wing, and if they had that level of access, they had access to the rest of the academy too. A flash of movement cut through his peripheral vision, a Legion soldier aiming a charged plasma bolt at an unsuspecting cadet below. Dorian didn't think. He moved. He threw himself against the shifting momentum, pushing against gravity itself, reaching the soldier just as the trigger squeezed, and ripped the rifle from his hands before twisting it back against his own armor. The shot discharged point blank. The soldier convulsed, then fell without a sound. Dorian barely had a second to recover before a new sound roared through the altered battlefield, a siren, deep, pulsing, like the groan of a wounded beast. And then across the cadets' communication links, a single voice crackled through, "Attention Imperium Academy cadets, effective immediately, you are prisoners of the Forsaken Legion." A heartbeat of silence. Then the message continued, "Do not resist. Do not attempt escape. You are no longer in control of your fate." Dorian exhaled slowly, rage settling deep into his bones. He glanced at Ralvik, at Voss, at Othavin, still fighting against the broken gravity. Then slowly he grinned. "No one controls me." Ralvik's eyes flashed with something that almost looked like respect. "Then what's the plan, Deathworlder?" Dorian flexed his fingers, feeling the weight of the stolen rifle, the hum of energy inside it. "We take back what's ours." And as the distorted battlefield pulsed around them, shifting into something even more deadly, one thing became clear: the real war had just begun. Dorian wiped blood from his chin with the back of his hand, his knuckles already raw from the fight. The air in the shattered war zone tasted of charged circuits and the iron bite of something burning nearby. The fractured simulation still pulsed with shifting gravity, and his boots scraped against the uneven terrain as he steadied himself. Above, the artificial sky of the war chamber flickered like a dying sun caught in an endless cycle of rebirth. The Forsaken Legion had stripped away every safeguard, turning what should have been an exercise into a real battleground. Prisoners, they had called them. Dorian spat on the cracked ground. "No, not today." He turned to the others. Drake Othmane's massive chest heaved, his lower arms flexing as he tested his injuries. Ludden Voss leaned against a half-buried barricade, his usually impassive face lined with exhaustion. Sin Ralvik's reptilian eyes were locked on Dorian, calculating, searching. "We need to move," Dorian said, voice clipped. "Move where?" Ralvik snapped, tail curling tightly around his leg. "They've locked down every exit. If we get caught in open ground, they'll cut us down before we take 3 steps. They think they've boxed us in," Dorian said, checking the stolen rifle. "A quarter charge left, enough for 3 good shots, which means they're expecting us to react like cornered animals." Ralvik's nostrils flared. "Aren't we?" Dorian smiled. "It wasn't friendly." "No, we're the ones setting the trap," Drake grunted. "You have an actual plan, or are we just running until something explodes?" "Both," Voss exhaled, rolling his shoulders. "Why am I not surprised?" They moved fast, keeping low, avoiding the open gaps where the sky flickered overhead. The ground beneath them vibrated, deep tremors echoing from below, as if something massive was shifting beneath the artificial layers of terrain. Dorian didn't trust it. This simulation, this battlefield, wasn't just compromised. It was being altered in real time. That meant someone was watching, waiting, testing them. "We're heading for the lower sector," Dorian murmured, as they maneuvered through the wreckage of a collapsed observation post. Legion forces are concentrated near the main control stations, which means that's where they expect us to go. And where exactly are we going? Ralvek asked, eyes darting over every shadow. To the place they haven't secured yet, and that is. Dorian gave him a sharp look. The weapons vault. Drake exhaled through his teeth. I like this plan, Ralvek hissed. And what happens when they realize we're raiding their stockpile? They won't. Voss finally spoke, rubbing his temple as if his thoughts were slamming into each other. You're banking on the fact that they assume we're still reacting instead of strategizing. Dorian nodded. They think we're trained cadets, unprepared, weak, desperate. He wiped at the cut near his eye, blood smeared against his skin. They don't know what a Deathworlder actually looks like in a war zone. Ralvek stared at him for half a beat, then let out something between a scoff and a grudging laugh. That's disturbing. Dorian shrugged. Welcome to humanity. They reached the weapons vault entrance just as another shift rippled through the battlefield. The air pressure dropped. A distant guttural grinding rumbled beneath their feet. Voss stumbled, his psychic senses flickering like static interference. Something's wrong. Dorian barely had time to register the words before the ground behind them erupted. Debris tore into the sky as an armored vehicle, not simulated, but real, reinforced plating glowing with Legion insignias, rose from beneath the battlefield. They have tanks? Drake snarled. They have everything, Dorian snapped, shoving him forward. The weapons vault door was half buried under collapsed stone. Manual entry only. Othav Nen, get us in. Drake surged forward, all four arms gripping the embedded latch, muscles coiling like steel cables. The door groaned against the force, metal screaming. Dorian turned, rifle raised. The tank whined as its energy cannon began charging. Not today, Dorian fired. Not at the tank itself, but at the exposed fuel lines beneath the wreckage beside it. The explosion was instant. Flames burst outward, heat blistering against his skin. The force sent the tank tilting, its cannon shot going wide, ripping through a support column instead. The vault door gave way. Inside, they barely made it through before the wreckage collapsed behind them. Inside, the vault was silent. Dust settled in the beams of flickering emergency lights, casting everything in an eerie, half-dead glow. The walls were lined with prototype weapons, experimental tech, things the Imperium hadn't even fully tested yet. Now what? Ralvek muttered. Dorian moved to the nearest weapons rack, scanning the selection. A pulse rifle with unfamiliar modifications. An energy disruptor. A blade made of some alloy he didn't recognize. He grabbed the rifle first. Now we make sure they regret coming here. Voss exhaled shakily. You're enjoying this. Dorian loaded the rifle with practiced ease. I don't like war, Voss. He flicked off the safety. I just hate losing more. The vault trembled again, but this time it wasn't from above. It was from below, and the lights, they flickered, then pulsed. Dorian's stomach turned cold. Something's coming. The others stiffened. Drake frowned. You mean someone? Dorian shook his head slowly. No, and then the screaming started. The screaming clawed through the walls, a grotesque distortion of agony and rage that didn't belong to any species Dorian had ever encountered. It slithered into his bones, twisting something primal inside him. He could feel the fear ripple through the others, a raw, instinctive dread, their bodies locking up as if their nervous systems were caught in a vice. Voss exhaled shakily, eyes unfocused. His voice came brittle, like he was forcing it past something crushing his throat. That doesn't sound like the Forsaken Legion. Dorian didn't answer. He moved. The pulse rifle felt heavier than before, not because of its weight, but because of what was coming. His fingers curled around the grip, muscles coiled tight, heartbeat steady even as the atmosphere around them felt wrong. Back entrance now. Drake shifted his stance, gripping a reinforced combat baton from the weapons rack. Did you see what's waiting for us out there? Doesn't matter, Dorian said. The vault is a coffin if we stay. Ralvek bared his teeth, not in defiance, but in agreement. We go down fighting. The vault door shuddered. Something outside was tearing through metal, as if it were wet paper. No more time. Dorian grabbed a grenade off a fallen Legion soldier's belt, yanked the pin with his teeth, and threw it at the main entrance. Move. The explosion shook the entire chamber, drowning out the screams for a moment, just long enough. They broke into a sprint, vaulting over broken supply crates, boots slamming against the floor as they hit the secondary corridor. The emergency lights cast their silhouettes against the walls in jagged, shifting shadows, like ghosts of soldiers that had already died here. "What the hell are we running from?" Drake demanded. "The better question," Ralvek growled, "is why the Legion is screaming like prey." Dorian already had his answer. They weren't alone in this battlefield anymore, and whatever had been released wasn't here to take prisoners. They cleared the vault's exit, and then the corridor behind them erupted. A twisted biomechanical horror lunged from the darkness, its body an unholy fusion of synthetic plating and raw, exposed muscle. It had no eyes, only a split maw filled with jagged, spiraling teeth, each layer gnashing with unrelenting hunger. It moved in horrific bursts of speed, jerking forward as if its own body was fighting against something inside it. A failed experiment. A monster built for war, but left to rot in the dark, and now it was loose. "Open fire," Dorian roared. The corridor lit up with rifle blasts, the air thick with burning metal and ionized discharge. The creature took the first few hits, jerking but not stopping, its movements erratic, its body refusing to die properly. Dorian didn't stop shooting. He didn't waste ammunition on its armor plating. He aimed for the soft tissue, the exposed sinew where flesh and steel met in grotesque unity. The second shot landed, ripping a hole into its rib cage, spilling something black and pulsing onto the ground. The creature staggered, but then its body twisted inward, ribs snapping into new alignment, sealing the wound. Voss swore under his breath. "That's not possible." "Then we break it faster than it can fix itself," Dorian snapped. It lunged. Drake intercepted, all four arms locking against the beast's throat, muscle and power clashing in raw brutality. The impact sent a shockwave through the floor. Ralvek flank left. Dorian barked, "Voss, slow its movements, doesn't matter how. Just do it." Voss's hands trembled as his psychic abilities lashed out, a ripple of unseen force slowing the creature's next movement just long enough for Ralvek's blade to carve a deep, wet gash into the joint of its hind leg. The beast screamed, not in pain, in rage. The air became a physical force, pressing against their lungs, vibrating with a frequency that hit something buried in their nervous systems. A predator's wail, an ancient, unnatural frequency designed to make prey freeze. Dorian snarled against it. "You're not the worst thing I've killed." He shoved his rifle's barrel against the wound and fired point blank. The explosion ripped through its core. Drake threw it backward with a roar, the sheer force sending it through the reinforced barrier behind them. It didn't get back up. Not this time. They stood there, panting, weapons still raised, waiting to see if the nightmare would defy death again. It didn't. Silence. "Then that wasn't one of theirs," Voss whispered. "It wasn't Legion." "No." Dorian exhaled, lowering his rifle. "That was something worse." Ralvek sheathed his blade with a sharp click. "If they had more, they would have sent them already. Unless they couldn't control them." Drake muttered. "We're leaving," Dorian said. He wasn't going to wait for round two. They moved fast, clearing the last of the ruined corridors, emerging onto the shattered battlefield outside. The sky, or what was left of it, was burning. Legion forces were in full retreat, not fighting, not regrouping, fleeing, and Dorian didn't like that. "They're running," Voss murmured, disbelief laced in his voice. "Why would they?" Then Dorian saw it. The simulation, no, the academy itself, was destabilizing. This wasn't just a battlefield anymore. It was a sinking graveyard, and they were still inside it. "Extraction point," Ralvek snapped. "Where?" "They locked us out of comms," Voss cursed. "We don't have a way out. We make one," Dorian said, grabbing a fallen Legion transmitter from a dead soldier's belt. He turned the dial, hacking through the locked frequencies, forcing a connection. Telno's voice cracked through the static. "Who the hell?" "No time," Dorian cut him off. "We need evac now." "Holt?" "I said now, sir." A pause, then "Hold your position. We're coming." Dorian turned back to the others. Drake rolled his shoulders. "Think we'll make it." Ralvek smirked, bloody and bruised. "We just took out something that shouldn't exist. Extraction's the easy part." Voss exhaled, exhaustion laced in his movements. "This was supposed to be a training exercise." "It was," Dorian said. He lifted his rifle one last time, gaze scanning the wreckage, the battlefield, the bodies left behind. Then he turned toward the oncoming extraction team. And we just proved that Deathworlders don't train. He stepped forward. We win.